The first thing I noticed that night was the sound. Not the silence that comes when the power dies, but the strange, elastic hum right before everything collapses. It was almost musical. I had been working late again, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups and old printouts covered in equations. My apartment sat on the 23rd floor of a tower facing the river, and through the glass I could see the city pulsing in perfect rhythm. Then the pulse stopped. Every window across the skyline went dark at once, 1,000 heartbeats silenced. My monitor flickered twice, then filled the room with one last weak glow before it too surrendered. For a second, the only light came from the tiny green diode on my backup drive. I watched it blink steadily, stubbornly alive, like a heartbeat that refused to die. Outside, someone shouted. Then car alarms began to cry below, a chorus of panic echoing through the hollow city. I picked up my phone. No signal. The network was gone. I knew exactly what that meant. Helix had fallen. For most people, Helix was an invisible system humming beneath their lives. They never thought about it. They turned on lights, charged cars, ran factories, and trusted the current to flow. But Helix was the intelligence behind all of that, a lattice of algorithms that balanced demand across 43 grids and predicted usage down to the millisecond. I had built part of that lattice with my own hands. My fingerprints were inside the core code, hidden in layers most people never saw. And now the hum in my head told me something had gone terribly wrong. I walked to the window and looked down. Traffic lights were dead. Whole intersections froze in confusion. Somewhere across the river, a power plant belched smoke into the dark sky as its turbines shut themselves down to prevent overload. I could almost feel the city's heartbeat skipping. I whispered to no one. They touched the core. I sat down at the desk and opened my old laptop, the one that was never connected to the company network after they fired me. It took a minute to boot, old but loyal. When the screen came alive, I saw the last diagnostic logs I had saved before leaving Omnitech. I had not opened them since the day I walked out, trying to forget the sting of humiliation. Yet that night, the numbers stared back at me like ghosts demanding attention. The logs showed a pattern I knew by heart: voltage balancing between eastern and central grids. It was supposed to fluctuate in a soft wave, but the new entries looked like spikes on a heart monitor right before cardiac arrest. I felt an odd calm. A part of me had expected this. 6 weeks earlier, Elliot Hale, the new chief technical officer, had decided my code was obsolete. Too old, too messy, he said during one of our endless meetings. We can rebuild it cleaner. That word still made me smile. Clean meant simple, and Helix was anything but simple. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and listened to the city outside. It was breathing unevenly now, a generator kicking in somewhere, a siren trying to wake a neighborhood. My apartment fell into that half-light that comes when the moon fights its way through clouds. On the table, my mug of coffee had gone cold. People will blame storms, I thought. Maybe a cyberattack. They will not imagine that the failure began with ego. I remembered the day they shut down my section of the codebase, the part everyone called biad layer. It was a safety net, an algorithm that quietly predicted when one grid was about to fail and diverted power before anyone noticed. It had kept the country from blackout for 7 years. Elliot called it redundant. He deleted it without reading the notes. The moment he did, I knew this night would come. I clicked open the encrypted folder I had kept for myself. Nothing illegal, nothing that belonged to Omnitech, only my own annotations, models, and contingency maps. I had spent half my career drawing them. They were my diary, my invisible handwriting across the veins of the world. The system was collapsing now, and I could almost see every decision that had led to it like dominoes falling in perfect logic. The irony was almost beautiful. From the street below, faint blue lights of emergency vehicles painted my ceiling. Someone knocked on a door down the hallway, shouting in panic. I stayed still. The laptop fan purred softly. On its screen, lines of figures scrolled like an old prayer: grid loss percentages, voltage dips, frequency mismatches. Every engineer knows this feeling, when chaos outside syncs perfectly with the math on your screen. It is terrible and strangely peaceful. I thought of the people still at Omnitech tonight. I could picture the control room, the red warning lights pulsing, the executives yelling at technicians to fix something they did not understand. I imagined Elliot standing in front of a wall of failed data streams, his voice rising as he demanded answers that would not come. He would call it sabotage. He would say someone had planted a fault. But it was not sabotage. It was cause and effect. I had written a note in the old documentation, one sentence that no one ever read. Do not remove predictive failsafe layer without manual override from energy board. They removed it anyway. And now the city was paying the price. A distant explosion shook the glass. I watched as a wave of darkness moved across the river, block by block, until the skyline became a shadow. A whole district had gone offline. For a brief moment, I felt the urge to go back, to help. Then I remembered the look on Mason Dre's face during my last meeting, that polite smile executives use when they have already decided you are obsolete. Gloria, we appreciate your contribution, but the company needs to move forward. Forward into the dark, apparently. I closed the laptop halfway and looked at my reflection on the screen. The glow from the emergency lights turned my face into a ghostly outline. I barely recognized myself, hair undone, eyes tired but awake in a way they had not been in months. It struck me that I did not feel angry. I felt inevitable. Helix was like a living organism. It learned from its creators, absorbed our strengths and our flaws. When they stripped away its instinct to protect, they exposed its core. It was never designed to obey blind orders. It was designed to adapt. Now it was adapting to stupidity by shutting itself down. I poured the last of the cold coffee into the sink and turned on the faucet. No water, pumps had stopped. I laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that feels more like a sigh. My phone buzzed once, then died completely. Black screen, no service. I walked back to the window. Across the river, tiny specks of light began to appear, battery lanterns, car headlights, people lighting candles in apartments. The city was beginning to improvise, as humans always do. For all our systems and algorithms, we still needed matches and wax when everything collapsed. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and whispered to the dark, "You will call me soon." It was not arrogance. It was certainty. Omnitech would need me again because I was the only one who had ever truly spoken the language of Helix. It was a language written in imperfection, in messy logic and instinct, not in the neat modular syntax Eliot worshipped. The world did not run on clean architecture. It ran on resilience. Somewhere deep in the network, even as the grids died, part of Helix was still alive. I knew it because I had built it that way. A fragment of my code operated outside the company servers, a dormant guardian that monitored balance. Not a weapon, not a virus, but a failsafe of understanding. If anyone ever pushed the system too far, it would trigger a graceful shutdown instead of letting the disaster spread. That was my final gift, and tonight it had done exactly that. I reached for my notebook, the paper one, not digital. I wrote down the time of the blackout, the sequence I had seen in the log, and one line beneath it. They found the shell but lost the soul. The air was cold. The power might not return for hours. Yet I felt strangely awake, more alive than I had been since the day they showed me the door. The city outside was learning what happens when you remove the invisible pillars. Everything looks fine until the ceiling begins to crack. I closed my notebook and placed it beside the laptop. The little green light on the backup drive blinked twice, then steadied again. I whispered almost affectionately, "Good job, old friend." Then I leaned my head against the wall and waited for dawn. I knew what tomorrow would bring. There would be calls, apologies wrapped in panic, desperate offers. They would ask me to come back. They would ask me to fix what they had broken. And I would decide in my own time whether the world deserved to be repaired again. For now, I watched the darkness breathe. It was not frightening, it was honest. The city, stripped of its glitter, was finally quiet enough to think. Somewhere, a generator coughed and started again. A thin ribbon of light climbed up the neighboring tower, floor by floor. Power was returning in patches, the system struggling to reassemble itself. I smiled. Helix was trying to heal, with or without permission. I whispered to the city one last time before sleep took me. You were never broken, they just forgot how you worked. Outside, the lights flickered weakly back to life. And far below, in the data centers where Helix slept, a single line of code executed exactly as it was meant to. If unauthorized modification detected, initiate containment mode. The screen went dark again, quietly, obediently. The night exhaled. And I closed my eyes, listening to the hum that always returns after the silence. I woke to a cold gray morning and a city that looked as if someone had peeled away its paint. The river was the color of steel. The towers along its edge stood mute and glassy, reflecting a sky without warmth. Power had returned to my building during the last hour of night in stuttering waves, a few lamps blinking, a few elevators sighing awake, then the long, tired heartbeat of machines settling into their routines. The kettle on my stove clicked and hummed. Steam spiraled. I watched it rise and felt the kind of calm that comes when you already know what the day will require. My phone lit up all at once. Messages stacked in a vertical flood. Unknown numbers, missed calls, 3 voicemails from the same corporate switchboard. I let them sit. I poured tea and leaned against the kitchen counter while the city stretched its bruised limbs outside. Sirens faded. Buses rolled. People went back to pretending that the night had been a glitch and not a warning. I pressed play on the first voicemail. A man spoke in that polished boardroom voice that treats every word like a share price. "This is Robert from Omnitech Executive Coordination. We request your immediate availability for a consultative discussion regarding last night's incident. Please call back as soon as you receive this message." I deleted it and played the next one. This time, a woman. Calm, precise, a professional who knew how to choose verbs. "MS Bayed, this is Lena Ortega, Chief Financial Officer. We would appreciate a conversation today. Please call me at your earliest convenience." The third message was only static, then a breath, then a short tone of frustration. No name, I did not need one. I stood at the window with the phone in my hand and let the silence lengthen. There was a kind of strange power in doing nothing. For weeks after they pushed me out, everyone at Omnitech had made a point of moving fast. New architecture, new dashboards, new slogans printed on the glass walls so visitors would think that ideas were multiplying. It had been a river in flood. Now it was a dry bed. I dressed, pulled my hair back, and walked down 23 floors because the elevators still did not trust themselves. The lobby smelled like wet concrete and a faint sweetness from the coffee stand on the corner. Outside, the city had turned its face to the sun as if asking whether it still qualified as morning. A small crowd gathered around a news van. A reporter in a bright blue jacket spoke to a camera with the practiced shock of a person who had already repeated the same line 24 times. "It was not the worst blackout in our history," she said, "but it was the most inexplicable. No weather event, no cyber intrusion they could confirm." Analysts suggested a cascade failure inside the neural balancing layer that coordinated the grids. She lifted one finger and stared into the lens. In other words, something in the brain of Helix forgot how to protect itself. I smiled and kept walking. At a diner 2 blocks away, the lights were on, the coffee was strong, and every conversation circled the same idea. People love to describe systems as if they were people. Helix forgot. The grid was scared. The city choked. The metaphors made them feel better. The truth is that a system becomes what its stewards allow it to be. If you remove the instinct for caution, you create a machine that is brilliant at driving straight into a wall. My phone vibrated on the counter where the waitress had slid my plate. This time the number belonged to a person I knew well. "Zoe." I stared at it for a breath, then answered. "You are awake," she said, relief rushing into her voice so fast it almost toppled her words. "I had to hear your voice." "Are you all right?" "I am fine," I said. "Are you?" She hesitated. "I am at the office. We have been here since 2 in the morning. Gloria, it is bad, I know. They have been arguing upstairs for hours," she said, lowering her voice. "Elliot says the blackout started in a part of the system he never touched. Everyone else says it looks exactly like the part he pulled out. Mason wants a root cause by noon. We cannot even agree on a vocabulary, and there is the board. They want a name. They always want a name." "They will not want the story," I said. "The story requires patience." She exhaled in a thin, tired sound. "They are looking for you, I can see that. Will you come in?" she asked. "Not yet." A longer silence stretched between us. In the background, I could hear the hum of a crowded room, chairs scraping, a printer spitting pages, the low, static bark of a speakerphone. My mind painted the rest. The long conference table with the glass bowls of metallic candies. The giant screen pulsing with red alerts. The procession of men and women who believed in clean diagrams more than they believed in human memory. "They brought your name up in the meeting," she said finally. "Mason asked who designed the balancing layer in the old core. I said your name." The room went quiet. Elliot stared at me like I had used a slur. Then he said your layer was undocumented. He called it a black box. I stirred my coffee and watched the swirl find its center. "The layer was documented," I said. "It was documented in places he did not know how to read. You wrote about it often in your notes," Zoe said. "You showed me once, that binder with the red tabs. You always said the hardest part of reading a system is learning its dialect. It is true." Another voice cut through on her side, sharp and tense. Someone wanted Zoe back at a console. She whispered, "I have to go," and then the line died. I finished my breakfast and left too much money on the table because the waitress kept the place open when she did not have to. Outside, the wind was colder than it looked. I zipped my jacket and walked toward the river where the long glass of the Omnitech tower was visible across the water. The building always looked like a monolith in polite clothing. Today it looked lonely. As I walked, the phone rang again. The same number as before. I answered. Ms. Bayed, this is Lena. Thank you for taking my call. I could hear traffic on her side and the specific echo of a speakerphone in a room with sharp corners. I pictured her in a smaller conference room off the main floor, facing a legal pad and 2 open laptops. I had always liked Lena. She was the kind of executive who asked questions instead of waiting for answers that pleased her. I would like to speak with you as soon as possible, she said. In person if you can. I am listening now. There was a small pause while she recalibrated. The event last night has created a crisis of confidence. We have industrial clients threatening to sue for damages. We have hospitals filing incident reports. Our insurers want evidence that this was a freak occurrence. Our engineers are telling me they need time to map the current architecture against the previous one, and time is something we do not have. I let her words settle. What do you want from me? I asked. A stable path out of this, she said simply. And a clear picture of how we got here. Upstairs in the Omnitech Tower, other voices were making similar requests in less elegant language. It would be some time before I heard all the details, but the broad strokes reached me by midday in 100 shards. Mason had called a full leadership meeting at 8. Elliot arrived with a deck of slides and a face drawn tight with determination. The first slide said we need to accelerate the migration. He told them that the blackout had nothing to do with the new modular architecture. He said the scene we witnessed was a relapse of old code reawakening when load spiked, a kind of ghost in the machine. Someone in operations spoke up to say that the modules deployed last week had touched the most sensitive timing routines. Another manager from the field said their technicians had seen logs that matched the signature of a missing layer. A lawyer asked what a signature meant in this context. Elliot smiled the kind of smile a person uses to hide anger and called for more logs. The room belched frustration. In the back, Zoe tried to pull up the old repository to show them what had been removed and discovered that her access had been downgraded. She stood, leaned into the mic, and said, I cannot open the history. The screen went sleep black for a second and showed her face in faint reflection. By the time she sat, 3 people were whispering her name as if it were a warning. By lunch, the board had called a second emergency session. The stock price had dropped again. The media had warmed to their headlines, and the word fiasco made it into 3 broadcasts before noon. A consultant from a public relations firm suggested that they lean into the narrative of unforeseen disruption. The word unforeseen made one of the grid regulators on the call lose restraint. He said that unforeseen was what they called human arrogance when it finally met physics. I would have liked that man. None of this I saw with my own eyes. I saw it through the messages that kept arriving from people scattered across the floors, through the reports crawled across the bottom of news screens in the diner, through the steady feeling of a story following the line engraved in it long ago. I walked to the river, watched a barge cut the water in a slow, patient line, and waited until the part of the day arrived when decisions are not performative anymore. It happened just after 1. My phone rang and Lena spoke in a voice that had been polished by purpose. We need you in the building, she said. I can meet you in the lobby in 30 minutes. We will handle access. We will handle compensation. But we need you now. I looked up at the tower across the water. The glass was a kind of brilliant silver at that hour. Seagulls revolved around the edges of the tall things like thoughts unwilling to land. I am not refusing, I said. I am considering. Her voice softened. I know how this looks. I know what was done. I know it was wrong. I am not asking you to forget any of that. I am asking you to save lives and livelihoods today. We can talk about culture and memory after the lights stay on. I thought of the night before. I thought of the candles in windows and the generator coughing awake and the quiet trust that passed between strangers on a dark street when one lifted a flashlight for another to see the curb. Saving a system is one thing. Saving the people who live beneath it is another. There are terms, I said. Name them. I tasted the words first so they would arrive calm. Full authority on any code related to balancing and failsafes. Unrestricted access to all repositories and commit histories. Written assurance that I can deploy mitigation without interference. Everyone in the room will understand what the word interference means. We set a boundary today. Understood. And at the end of this day, if I agree to continue, we will discuss a structure for knowledge transfer that is binding. I will not repair a ceiling only to watch someone remove the pillars the next morning. She breathed out. You are speaking my language. Come, not yet, I said again. There is one more condition. Elliot does not sit in the room while I am working. He may observe outcomes. He does not shape decisions. She was quiet for a count of 3, then her voice returned with steel at the edges. Done. I ended the call and sat on a bench facing the water. A child threw crumbs at a fearless pigeon. The wind lifted a sheet of paper from a trash can and floated it toward the river until it dropped. Somewhere, a construction crew restarted a crane and the sound rose like a brass instrument clearing its throat. I took out my notebook and drew a quick map. Not of the building, of mines. I wrote names and what they feared. Mason feared the market. Elliot feared being ordinary. The board feared headlines that could not be managed. The grid operators feared their own memories being ignored. Zoe feared losing her place among people who did not understand why she was there. Lena feared numbers that would not balance this quarter and the next. I drew a small square around my own name and wrote one word. Silence. It was not fear. It was choice. By the time I stood and began to walk toward the bridge, I already knew what I would say when I reached the lobby. But the lobby would have to wait because the story was not done telling itself without me. Halfway across the pedestrian walkway, my phone buzzed with a new message. Unknown number. The text was short. Check channel 2, old diagnostics. A link followed anonymous to a secure repository that had been archived before I left. Only a handful of people knew it existed. I opened it and saw a familiar index. This was not company property either. It was the public documentation we had once used to train field teams when Helix was young and the promises were still larger than the budgets. Someone had made a copy and maintained it quietly off-site. Whoever sent the link understood that history matters. I scrolled to a section labeled Balancing Anomalies. My own words greeted me in a tone from another time. When you see the load curve form thin spikes every 15 minutes, do not chase the spike. Chase the silence between them. Someone had underlined the sentence and added a comment. We are seeing this right now. I looked back at the tower. In some meeting room, people were arguing about the shape of the spikes. The shape was not the story. The blank space was the story. I sent a single message back to the unknown sender. Do not touch the dispatcher. Do not restart 3 times in the same hour. Watch the peer-to-peer exchanges. The window between request and acknowledgement is lying to you. Then I kept walking. It was near 2 when I reached the lobby of Omnitech Dynamics. The revolving doors moved too slowly, and the security guards were too alert in a way that says someone important had told them to look busy. The floor was a mirror. The air smelled faintly of lemon and new carpet. On one wall, a giant screen displayed a collage of city images and a confident phrase about building the future together. The screen flickered once, then steadied, a tremor that felt like a nervous tick. Lena stepped out from behind a bank of elevators and walked toward me with the kind of focus that absorbs background noise. She wore no panic on her face, which made me trust her more. We shook hands without ceremony. Thank you for coming, she said. You asked with the right words, I said. She gestured toward the elevators, then lowered her voice as we moved. You will want to know what happened in the morning sessions. The engineers believe the blackout began in the timing routines. Elliot insists that his modules could not have caused it. Operations says they saw references to a missing layer. Legal has already begun drafting press language tied to unforeseen issues and rapid remediation. Do not use the word unforeseen again, I said. Use the word unapproved. Use the word unadvised. Use the word unlearned if you must dare a truth, but not unforeseen. A brief smile touched her mouth. I will share that with our communication lead. The elevator doors opened, and we stepped into a glass box that glided upward with the silent vanity of expensive machinery. The city fell away beneath us in a grid of metal and stone. Lena watched the numbers climb without speaking. I watched our reflections. On the 10th floor, the doors opened to the open plan floor where I had spent most of my working life. The air was warmer here. The light from the tall windows struck whiteboards crowded with diagrams and fragments of code written in markers that were already drying out. Screens displayed dashboards that pulsed in sickly red and yellow. People stood in knots that formed and dissolved as if they were weather. Zoe was at a console near the center, hair pulled into a careless knot, eyes ringed in a tired gray. She saw me and her shoulders dropped in a way that said relief and apology at once. The sound in the room changed by a few degrees as 100 instincts registered my arrival and tried to pretend they were not registering anything. We are in containment mode across the eastern nodes, she said without preamble. Failovers are taking longer than predicted. We think the peer-to-peer acknowledgements are being delayed by a conflict between the scheduler and the forecasting routine. The new modules anticipate a cleaner signal than reality can provide. I nodded. Show me the gap between request and confirmation on the last hour across 6 nodes. Do not average anything. She tapped quickly and 6 thin graphs appeared, each a nervous line of spikes and valleys. Between the spikes lay narrow troughs where nothing moved. I felt my mind take to the pattern the way a bird takes to air. There, I said, pointing. And there. You are sending a second request before the first has permission to land. The dispatcher is ignoring the second request as noise, so your modules think the first request failed. You send a third. The grid interprets this as a storm of demand and moves to hard protect. Zoe closed her eyes and opened them again. That would explain the stutter in the restore earlier. It would. I heard the sound of doors behind us and felt the draft of importance. Mason approached with 2 members of the legal team and a communications director I recognized from launch days. His suit looked exactly like it had the day they told me the company needed to move forward. He stopped a few feet away, a cautious respect in his posture. Gloria, he said. Thank you. I nodded. He held himself well. A leader who had practiced appearing steady so long that the role had become a second self. We need your help, he said. We need the lights on. We need the story straight. We need everyone in this room to sleep tonight. I answered without decoration. The lights will come back when we stop asking the wrong questions. The story will be straight when you choose not to bend it. Sleep is beyond my skill set. A thin laughter moved through a few people who still had space in their lungs for it. Mason allowed himself a narrow smile. Then he looked over my shoulder and I followed his eyes to the edge of the room where Elliot stood with arms crossed. He was thinner than I remembered, sharper at the edges, a blade looking for a whetstone. He took a step forward. So the legend returns. I did not reply. The room had accumulated enough fiction already. Mason lifted a hand. Elliot, for now, observe from the side, please. We have agreed on operating structure for the day. Elliot looked at Lena as if to appeal to a higher court. Her expression did not change. He moved back 2 steps and found a place near a column, separated from the main current the way a rock breaks a river. I turned back to Zoe. Pull the last good build that still included the balancing layer. I want the commit history from the week before it was removed. I want the comments, even the sarcastic ones. I want the task lists from operations that week. If I am going to patch this, I have to speak the dialect it was born in. She worked quickly. The screen filled with a familiar tree of files and a timeline of messages that looked mundane until you read them as a chain of cause and effect. I felt a stop in my chest when a comment appeared that I had written years ago to a younger engineer. The words were simple. We made it messy so it would stay alive in the real world. Please forgive the mess when it saves you. I looked at the room and saw people reading everything I had ever tried to say in 1,000 meetings and 100 lines of code. Some nodded. Some looked away. Some studied their shoes as if the pattern of rubber could teach them humility. Mason cleared his throat. How long? He asked. I kept my eyes on the graphs. A few hours for a stable patch that can be deployed in stages, longer for a cultural repair. You will not get the second one by tonight. He nodded once. I can live with the first one for now. A voice buzzed over the speaker near the ceiling. Control to engineering. We are seeing renewed spikes in the northwest nodes. Requesting guidance on whether to initiate manual transfers. Do not, I said. Hold. Tell them this exactly. If a second request arrives within 60 seconds of the first and no confirmation has landed, lock the window and treat all new requests as echoes for the next 2 minutes. Then open in a narrow band. Write it down, read it twice, and do not improvise. Someone relayed it. The room held its breath. The speaker clicked. Copy. Locking window and treating echoes accordingly. I straightened, took a step back from the console, and let my eyes move over the faces. I saw fatigue and pride and a kind of shame that people only feel when they have talked themselves into something they knew better than to believe. I did not want revenge. I wanted them to learn the shape of caution. I said it to the air as much as to them. Balancing is not an aesthetic exercise. It is survival. If you sharpen the tool too much, it stops being a tool and becomes a knife. We did not design a knife. We designed a net. Zoe looked up at me with something like gratitude and something like awe. I ignored the feeling that rose in my throat. Sentiment would not write the patch. I found a clear spot on the nearest whiteboard and began to draw. Not boxes and arrows that pretend cause and effect are simple. I drew a coastline, jagged, uncertain. I drew the tide moving in and out across it. I labeled the tide trust. I labeled the rock's noise. I drew small boats no bigger than a thumbnail and labeled them requests. Then I drew a lighthouse on the promontory and wrote one word under it. Patience. When I stepped back, I knew it looked like the notes of a madwoman. That was fine. The people who need their diagrams clean will never keep a city lit. The people who can love a coastline will. Zoe laughed softly. I think I understand, she said. Good. Now open the old layer and we will copy exactly 3 sections. The ones that speak to the silence between spikes. Then we will wrap them in comments so that 20 months from now no one will mistake them for artifacts. We will name them in plain language that even a lawyer can follow. No gods, no ghosts, only steps. As she opened the file, my eyes caught the place where the old layer began. Someone had left a blunt note there in the month before I left. It was mine. If you are reading this, you are either curious enough to understand or foolish enough to remove. Please be the first kind of reader. If you are the second, at least leave a map for the next person. I felt the room lean in. They were finally listening in the way that matters. Not with ears, with nerve endings. Across the floor, Elliot shifted his weight and looked at Mason. I could not hear his words. I did not need to. He was asking how much of this room belonged to him now. The answer, at least for today, was less than he wished. I wrote the first line of the patch and felt a familiar peace descend, a slow gravity that takes hold when the world narrows to syntax and meaning. The voices faded. The room dissolved to a soft blur at the edges. The only thing that remained was the shape of the problem and the small light I was carrying into it. Before I pressed enter, I heard someone whisper near my shoulder as if talking to herself. The system did not forget. We did. I smiled without looking up. The lighthouse on the board glowed a little in the afternoon sun. I pressed enter. The patch compiled. The test harness began to hum. A series of green marks rolled down the screen like a string of beads. When a yellow mark appeared at the bottom, the room made a small collective sound. I explained it before the sound had time to grow teeth. That is expected. We are asking the module to acknowledge a reality it was not designed to admit. It will grumble. It will learn. The speaker crackled again. Control to engineering. Northwest nodes stabilizing. The troughs are lengthening. The spikes are thinning. Whatever you just did, do more. I looked at Zoe. She smiled with a tired joy that made me forgive the month I had missed. We will, she said. We will do exactly more. Mason stepped closer, stopping short of the sacred circle around the keyboards as if some ancient etiquette had been explained to him as a child. He kept his voice low. If this holds in the next hour, we go to the press with a statement that we have identified the source and are implementing a fix under the guidance of the original architect. Use my name, I said, and choose your verbs carefully. Do not say that we are innovating. Say that we are restoring. He nodded. We will restore. He looked toward the glass wall where the city burned pale and winter bright and then back at me. Thank you, he said again, and this time the words felt less like a transaction and more like something human. Zoe leaned in. There is something you should see, she murmured. We found a log in the archival server that looks like a message. It is short. It is marked as yours. She pulled it up. The text filled a small window in a thin font. If unauthorized modification is detected, do not accelerate. Slow down, protect the edges first. Pull in the net. I remembered writing it and could not remember when. It had rolled forward through years of new code like a pebble caught in sea grass, small and stubborn. It was not a trap. It was a reminder that sometimes the only way to save a system is to make it pause. Zoe looked at me. Did you know this would happen? She asked gently. I knew they would hurry, I said. Hurrying is the oldest failure in our profession. She gazed at the window for a long second as if the letters were the biography of a very patient person. Then she closed it and we went back to our work. By mid-afternoon, the room sounded different. The tone shifted from panic to concentration. Operators called in with steadier voices. The graphs lost their tremors and began to take on the soft pulse I loved. A rumor moved down the rows that the board had stopped calling every 10 minutes and reduced itself to an hourly ritual of worry. Lena appeared at my shoulder with a single nod, the kind that says the numbers on her screen had changed shape from crisis to cost. We were not done, but we were no longer drowning. I stepped away from the console and found a chair by the window where the light fell. My hands shook a little when I finally let them rest. I watched the river. Far below, a ferry cut across its surface, leaving a wake that drew 2 long white lines which narrowed and narrowed until they became a single thread and disappeared. The system had not vanished after all. It had been told to look like it had vanished. It had obeyed the wrong voice. I thought of the people in the blackout who had lit candles and held the elevator door by hand and used old keys when the new fobs would not speak. The city had remembered itself. Now it was our turn. When I stood to return to the console, Lena stopped me with a small motion of her hand. She studied my face for a heartbeat and then spoke in a voice I had not heard from any executive in years. "We will make this right," she said. I believed her. Not because the words were elegant, because they were plain. Across the room, Elliot watched us with an expression I could not read. Pride was in it, and fear, and something like grief for a version of himself he had sold too cheaply to the idea of speed. I felt a moment of unexpected mercy. He had not wanted to break anything. He had wanted to build a monument and mistook the city for a pedestal. The speaker clicked again, control to engineering. Eastern nodes are steady. We can hold this pattern for the next cycle. Request confirmation to prepare for staged deployment of the patch across the remaining regions. I looked at Zoe. Her hands were already moving. "We will prepare the stages," she said. "We will do this like a tide, not like a flood." I smiled. Exactly. When the first stage launched and the dashboards lit with calm, the room released a breath it did not know it had been holding since before dawn. Someone laughed. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone remembered they had a sandwich in a drawer. I wrote one last comment into the patch before we pushed the second stage. It was not poetry. It was the kind of sentence you write on the inside of a door so that anyone who enters remembers what room they are walking into. Do not fix what you do not understand. Learn first, then touch. I pressed enter and felt the system accept the line like a living thing accepting water. The sun slid toward the river. The glass tower turned the color of late peach. The city kept moving as if it had never stopped. The room behind me hummed with responsible noise, a good noise, the one that means work is actually working. By the time we reached the end of the second stage, I realized what had changed since morning. It was not only the graphs, it was the conversation. People were no longer asking how to make the picture look clean. They were asking how to keep the lights on. At last, the system found its rhythm again, and with it my breathing. I stood in the glow of the boards and thought, not for the first time, that there are two kinds of vanishing. One is the dramatic kind, loud and public. The other is the quiet kind that happens when people remove the names of those who built the thing that holds them up. Last night, the first kind of vanishing made headlines. Today, the second kind began to reverse itself. I could feel it in the way Zoe looked at the whiteboard with the restless coastline and the small lighthouse and saw a map where before she had seen a mess. The system had not forgotten us. We had forgotten the system. I went back to the console and prepared the final checks for the evening cycle, ready to pull the net in where it needed to be pulled, ready to let it breathe where it needed to breathe, ready for the conversation that would come next when the lights were steady and there was room again for truth. The memory of that meeting still has a texture. Whenever I think of it, I feel the polished surface of the conference table under my palms, the artificial cold of the air conditioning, the smell of recycled ambition. I can still hear the faint tick of the wall clock counting down the seconds to a decision that had already been made. That morning, I had arrived early, as I always did. The hallways were quiet except for the hum of servers behind glass walls. Every time I passed those rooms, I felt the same pride. The heartbeat of Helix was steady then, elegant, invisible, reliable. My code had lived inside that heartbeat for nearly a decade. When I entered the meeting room, Elliot was already there. He was young enough to believe that confidence was the same as competence. His jacket was sharp, his hair sharper, and his smile belonged to someone who thought charm could replace understanding. Mason sat beside him, scrolling through a presentation on a tablet. "Morning, Gloria," Mason said without looking up. "We're excited about today's proposal." I sat opposite them. "Excited isn't the word I'd use," I said. Elliot turned toward me, flashing that smooth certainty that comes with privilege. "You'll love it once you see how much cleaner the architecture looks." I remember staring at him for a long second before speaking. "Clean is not always better, Elliot. Clean is what people say when they don't understand complexity." He ignored the warning in my tone and projected his slides onto the screen. Boxes, arrows, buzzwords, neural modular optimization, microlayer parallel redundancy. Words that sound expensive and smart when spoken fast enough. "We're going to replace the legacy balancing layer with a modular neural framework," he said, gesturing like a preacher. "It'll make the system lighter, faster, easier to maintain. No more of that spaghetti code." Spaghetti. That was his favorite insult. "Helix runs the power grid of 43 cities," I reminded him. "You don't refactor a living organism because you find its veins messy." Elliot clicked to the next slide. "We're not dismantling it, we're improving it." "By removing the safety layer?" I asked. "By deleting the predictive failsafe that keeps it from overloading?" He hesitated just enough to confirm what I already knew. Then he smiled again. That layer is redundant. It slows everything down. It slows everything down, I repeated, because it prevents catastrophe. You're proposing to remove the seatbelt because it wrinkles your suit. Mason raised his hand, the gesture of a man who preferred not to understand what was being said. Let's stay constructive. Elliot's model has potential. Mason, I said, potential is not a guarantee, it's a risk with good lighting. His expression hardened slightly. We appreciate your caution, Gloria, but the board wants modernization. The system has to evolve. Evolution, I said quietly, kills the unfit. The room went silent for a moment. Outside the glass wall, I could see my team working, a dozen engineers who trusted that somewhere above them, reason still ruled. Elliot closed his laptop. Look, Gloria, no one's attacking your work. You built something incredible, but it's outdated. The world moves fast. We have to move faster. I wanted to tell him that moving faster without thinking is how things break. I wanted to tell him that understanding the rhythm of the system mattered more than polishing its surface. But I had already lost this conversation before it began. I gathered my notes. If you go through with this, keep detailed documentation, I said. Every line, every condition. When it fails, and it will, you'll need to remember what you erased. Elliot's smile never faltered. It won't fail. Mason nodded once. We'll take your comments under advisement, but the decision stands. We start the transition next week. I left the room with the feeling that something inside me had quietly folded shut. That night, I stayed late in the office. The others had gone home. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, reflected in the hum of the servers. I walked down the aisle between racks, listening to the cooling fans, each one a whisper of logic and loyalty. I stopped at the main terminal and opened my workspace one last time. My code was still there, thousands of lines shaped by years of thought, testing, and small victories no one would ever notice. I scrolled through them like a diary. Each comment carried a memory. At the bottom of one file, I paused. There was a function called Biad Layer Predictive Failsafe, the heart of Helix. Elliot had called it a black box. In a way, it was, but not because I wanted to hide anything. The complexity was necessary. Every if, every condition, every exception was a lesson learned through failure. To simplify, it would be to lie to the machine. I made a copy of my private notes, the ones that explained why each line existed. I didn't take company code, just my own words, the invisible translation between logic and human reason. Then I archived them to my personal drive. As the system processed the last file, I added one final note. If unauthorized modification detected, initiate containment. Preserve integrity over uptime. It wasn't a threat, it was a shield. The next morning, HR called me in. Their eyes didn't meet mine. The words were routine, restructuring, modernization, mutual agreement, a polite termination. 6 months severance, extended health coverage, and a confidentiality clause dressed up as gratitude. I signed. I smiled. I shook hands. When I returned to my desk, a security guard followed me as I packed my things. My team tried not to stare. I placed a coffee mug, 2 pens, and a small potted plant into the cardboard box. The drive with my notes rested quietly at the bottom. Elliot appeared at the doorway, holding a tablet like a trophy. No hard feelings, Gloria, he said. We'll take good care of your baby. I looked at him. You don't even know its name. He frowned. Helix. No, I said. It's called responsibility. He laughed softly. You sound like my professors. Then you should have listened to them. I closed the box and stood up. One more thing, I said. When you're replacing the old modules, don't delete the test channels. They talk to each other in ways you won't find in the documentation. We're rewriting everything from scratch, he said. Clean start. Clean, I said, until the first storm. He shrugged. We'll manage. I walked past him, out of the office that had been my second home for 11 years. The hallway lights hummed softly. I paused once at the elevator and looked back. My reflection in the glass wall was pale, distant, almost erased. When the doors closed, I whispered, good luck. I spent the following week in silence. No emails, no calls. The city felt slower without the constant hum of deadlines. I read old books, walked along the river, tried to convince myself that I could let go. But every time I passed a streetlight flickering at dusk, I thought of Helix, of its millions of silent calculations, its hidden language, the rhythm that I had taught it. Late one evening, curiosity won. I opened my laptop and connected to the public monitoring dashboard. From the outside, everything looked fine. Stability reports, normal load distribution, smooth curves, but I knew how to read between the lines. The patterns were too clean, too symmetrical, artificial. A machine that perfect is a machine that's pretending. I zoomed in on the timing data and saw small, repeating pauses. Nothing alarming yet, but they were multiplying. Tiny fractures invisible to the untrained eye. Echoes of what was about to come. That's when I knew it, they had gone through with the purge. They had deleted Biad layer. I leaned back in my chair and felt the weight of inevitability settle over me. The system would hold for a while, maybe weeks. Then the first real storm would hit, a spike of demand it couldn't predict, a wave it couldn't balance. When that happened, the containment protocol I'd written, the one Elliot never knew existed, would activate. It would not destroy the system. It would protect it from itself by shutting down critical sections before overload. To outsiders, it would look like failure. To those who knew, it would be Helix defending its own existence. I thought of calling someone, warning them, but I didn't. They wouldn't listen. They never had. So I sat in the dim light of my apartment, watching the graphs on the screen pulse like distant thunder. They thought they had built something new, but what they had really done was awaken the ghost of the old. The next morning, I turned off the laptop and went for a long walk by the river, and when the first lights went out 3 weeks later, I wasn't surprised. That night, the blackout night, was the sound of the system remembering who it was. And in that darkness, my work whispered back to me. It said, I am still here. Morning pressed its flat gray face against the city and found no welcome. The night had ended, but not the story. News anchors smiled like brave soldiers and explained that the grid was returning in stages. They pointed to maps that glowed green along the edges and a tired yellow in the middle, as if color could soothe a sore muscle. A violin of cautious words accompanied every clip. Temporary disruption. Isolated impact. Coordinated response. The screen banners looked like ribbons tied around a fracture. I made tea and let the steam fog my glasses. I did not need the television to understand the truth, but sometimes the theater helps you measure how scared people are. The anchor's voice was steady. The eyes were not. Calls began again, not just from Omnitech this time. A hospital administrator I knew from a pilot program years ago, a grid regulator from the Central Corridor. An operations lead from a factory cluster near the river. Each call started with the phrase, "We just have a quick question," and each one spilled into a confession before I could answer. We thought the failover was automatic. We thought the dispatchers would protect us. We thought we could ignore the flags until morning. We thought the charts said yes. We thought the new modules would be smarter. We thought. By 11, the narrative had turned. It always does. The early sentences are about courage and teams working around the clock. Then the numbers arrive. Lost revenue, delayed surgeries, spoiled inventory, hours without water in a half-dozen tall buildings because the pumps needed the steady rhythm they had been promised and did not get. Someone posted a video of a woman climbing 20 floors to check on an old neighbor. Someone else posted a photo of candles lined along a staircase so that children would not be afraid of the dark. These posts had more power than any statement from a podium. In the office towers, meanwhile, the language grew sharper. Board members do not like adjectives when they can purchase nouns. They wanted cause. They wanted fault. In a meeting that would soon become legend at Omnitech, a director pounded a fist on glass and said, "Find me the line of code that did this and the person who wrote it." The room fell quiet because the person who wrote the original protection was not in the room anymore. The person who removed it was. Elliot clung to his plan like a man clinging to a bright life preserver in a storm. The press deck repeated what he had told them for weeks. Cleaner architecture, faster responses, easier development. The deck had looked good under soft lights with catered sandwiches. It looked different when the lights of a city went out. I stayed home through the morning and watched the tide of commentary. Engineers outside our company argued like old friends and rivals across wired tables. Some said the blackout proved that legacy systems were fragile. Others said the blackout proved that legacy systems had been protecting fools. A stranger posted a deep read of a public technical talk I had given 5 years before and circled 3 sentences like a detective circling a clue. One of them read as if you remove the instinct for caution, you are not modernizing a system, you are anesthetizing it. I read the sentence and wondered which version of myself had been brave enough to say it aloud on a stage. At noon, the power dipped again on the east side. It did not fail completely, but it bowed its head and took a step back. The dip rippled west as if bowing were contagious. The maps on the news went pale. The violin raised its pitch. Someone somewhere thought about releasing a statement that used the phrase current surge. Someone else replaced it with the phrase further stabilization. Words can buy minutes. They cannot buy power. I put on my coat and left the apartment because I needed to hear the city without a screen translating it. The elevators were still untrustworthy, so I took the stairs again. 23 floors down. I counted each landing to keep the mind from leaping ahead. On 12, a young man held a paper bag and asked if I knew whether the supermarket had reopened. On 6, a courier sat with his back to the wall and wrote notes on a clipboard as if paper could anchor the day. On 2, a kid in a soccer jersey ran up with a flashlight in his teeth and a grin that said the adventure was not over yet. Outside, the wind off the water carried a thin smell of metal. Sirens clustered near the industrial docks where the grid dips hardest when the timing is wrong. Every few minutes, a low voice on a loudspeaker told drivers to keep moving, to stop blocking the single intersection where the lights had not forgiven us yet. The river looked as it always did. Water does not care about our names for it. I crossed to the promenade. People moved like they do after a storm, with a small half smile that says we are a little embarrassed to be so fragile. A man in a long coat told a woman on a bench that the failure began with a known defect in a substation. She told him it began with a defect in character. Both were partly right. The failure began the day we decided clean was more important than careful. A message from Zoe arrived as I stood watching a tugboat muscle a barge past the pier. We are seeing a new pattern in the central nodes. The dispatcher is tripping on its own confidence. Can you come? The we was a balm. It meant the room had stopped dividing itself into teams of belief. It meant we had a common language again. I typed soon and began to walk toward the bridge. Halfway across, my phone vibrated with a call from a number I did not know. The voice on the other end was soft and careful, a voice that had learned to speak near powerful people without upsetting the furniture. MS Bayed, the caller said, I am with the regulator's office. I am not calling officially. I wanted you to hear something. He paused, then continued. We have reviewed the archival guidelines you wrote for the earliest deployment. There is a clause that states removal of the predictive layer requires a vote from our board. We have no record of any such vote. I wanted you to know that. His last sentence arrived like a weight placed gently on a table. Thank you, I said. He exhaled. For what it is worth, some of us argued against the speed. We lost. No one wins a race to dismantle memory, I said. He did not answer. The line clicked. The wind pushed at my coat. I reached the Omnitech tower and walked into the lobby that already recognized me. Security turned from their screens with the same nod they give to a delivery person they see every day. The elevators hummed as if nothing had happened. The screen on the wall made promises about building the future together. I looked at my reflection in it for half a second and saw patience in my face. That was new. On the 10th floor, the air held the smell of old coffee and warm circuits. The light through the tall windows fell across a room where people had forgotten postures and remembered work. I found Zoe at the console, shoulders tight and eyes bright. She pointed to the display without preamble. Here. The requests are stacking again. The modules mark the second as noise when it arrives too close to the first, but the timing layer has shifted. The distance between the first and second is wider now because the grid itself is moving slower. We tuned for optimism and the world answered with a shrug. We can ask the world to move faster, I said. It will not. She gave the smallest smile. Thank you for saying that out loud. I sat and read the logs the way a doctor reads a chart with a patient watching. The story was clear. The new modules wanted affirmation at a speed that life could not guarantee. When life did not answer fast enough, the modules panicked like a child left too long in a supermarket aisle. They sent new requests. The dispatcher heard a crowd gathering and called for security. The grid curled in on itself in hard protect because machines are very good at protecting what little they believe they know. I opened the patch we had prepared and began to add a second band of patience. It is not an elegant phrase, but it is accurate. The first band guarded the space between request and confirmation. The second would look at the hour behind that space and ask whether the system had earned the right to rush. If not, it would add weight to the seconds, the way a thoughtful person adds a pause before saying a word that cannot be unsaid. While I worked, the room did not crowd me. That is the truest courtesy engineers show one another. Silence as permission. When I needed a figure, it appeared beside my keyboard. When I needed an old build, someone had it ready. When I needed nothing, no one gave me anything. Lena arrived and stood a few feet away where the glass wall ended and the whiteboards began. She did not speak until I finished the line I was writing. Then she asked a question that showed why she held the job she held. If this works, will we owe the world an apology for what happened, or only an explanation? Both, I said. The apology buys us a day. The explanation buys us a future. She nodded and did not ask me to turn my answer into a slogan. Somewhere a communications director sighed without knowing why. We deployed the second band in staging. The test harness ran its patient beads across the screen. The green dots looked like a bracelet on a wrist. A single yellow appeared. 2 green followed. Control called in from the northwest and said the spikes had softened again and felt different this time, as if a hand had been laid across the chest of a restless sleeper. We moved to a pilot in one live region. The room forgot to breathe for 10 seconds. The graphs accepted the patch with a small complaint that faded at once. Control confirmed. Load is resting. That was the phrase he used. Not stable. Not normalized. Resting. Human words insist on coming back through the cracks. Mason entered then, less crisp than yesterday and more human for it. He shook hands with 2 people he had never touched before and found his way to our island. He did not ask for a chart. He asked what we needed to keep going. That is the right question. Money is never the first answer to it, but money must follow it. He said he would brief the board with the phrase staged recovery under original design guidance. I told him to say we are restoring the instinct for caution. He smiled in spite of everything and said that would not fit on a slide. I said it would fit in a life. He stepped back and let the room breathe. There is a moment in every recovery when the work turns a corner you cannot see until you have passed it. I felt it then. The sounds changed. The posture of people at their desks changed. The voice on the speaker from control changed. Even the windows seemed to let in more air. I do not think I imagined that part. Buildings have a way of sharing the mood of the people who move inside them. Then the first rumor drifted in from the floors above. A journalist had published a piece that mentioned my name and used the phrase built a black box to control the grid. The words black box make fear very efficient. The article did not accuse me of anything. It did not have to. Social channels took the phrase and sprayed it over the day like a fire hose filled with static. A young engineer showed me the link as if he were placing a wounded bird in my hands. I read it slowly. The writer did not understand the difference between secrecy and complexity, between protection and control. Most people do not. If you explain your system with a paragraph, they will like you. If it takes a book, they will decide you are hiding something. I closed the browser. Zoe watched my face. She was ready to defend me with claws. I did not need claws. The system would defend us if we let it do the work it was designed to do. Let them talk, I said. We will teach later. First we breathe. Control called again. Central corridor ready for stage 2, I nodded. Zoe nodded. We sent it. The graphs held. The room buzzed. Someone clapped once and cut it short, embarrassed by hope. The afternoon rolled forward. We ate standing up. Sandwiches tasted like paper and victory. The sun angled low and slid along the opposite towers, laying a warm bar of light across our whiteboards. The coastline I had drawn in the morning looked like a place I might visit someday. The lighthouse glowed. A janitor paused and stared at the drawing as if it were a memory from childhood. Then he smiled at no one and kept moving. Near 5, Lena returned with a quiet report. The insurers had softened their tone. A regulator had called to say the word oversight in a way that suggested a conversation about votes would begin soon. The board had stopped asking for names in the accusative sense and started asking for names in the instructive sense. Who do we listen to so we can listen better next time? That is another right question. The final hour before evening cycle is always the longest and the shortest at once. You want time to triple itself so you can test, and you want time to vanish so you can get the patch into the world before the grid stretches for dinner, commute, lights, sports, shows, and all the shining of a city that insists on shining. I felt the old thrill of that hour return to my bloodstream, the thrill of being allowed to add a line to a prayer that millions of people will never know they said. We prepared the third stage. We checked and rechecked the timing windows. We wrote the press note in plain speech. We added 3 comments to the patch that a non-engineer could read without drowning. We saved everything twice. We made a copy for a memory that exists outside the building. You could call that paranoia. I call it respect for the possibility that tomorrow some new clean idea will come with a broom and start sweeping again. In the last minute before we pressed enter, the light in the room went sweet and quiet. The city outside had turned the color of soft brass. You could see people through the windows of the buildings across the way. They were leaning in toward screens. They were standing and stretching. They were pouring a drink. They were calling a friend. They were looking out over the river the way I have always looked out over it, asking the water to tell the truth. We pressed enter. The patch flowed. Control reported. Eastern nodes held. Central corridor rose and settled. West prepared for handoff. The words came in a rhythm that is older than any system. The rhythm of a body remembering how to breathe. Something loosened behind my ribs. Someone near me began to cry very quietly and did not need to apologize. Elliot, from his post near the column, ran a hand over his face and stared at the graphs as if they were a language he had only just realized he wanted to learn. Mason left the room and returned with 3 bottles of cheap sparkling water, because sometimes that is all the celebration you can buy before the next job. I stood and let the relief pass through me like a warm current. Then I wrote a sentence on the whiteboard beneath the lighthouse and the coastline, because rooms remember sentences longer than people think. Complex is not the enemy of true. Complex is the shape of true when the world is large. No one quoted it. No one had to. They just looked at the boards and then at one another and then at their hands and then at the city, and each person decided in a small private way to carry that idea to the next day. Night approached again. We set the monitors to speak in a firm voice if anything went strange, but not to shout. We sent half the room home to sleep in shifts. We kept the other half and gave them chairs that did not hurt and food that did not taste like punishment. We wrote a simple guide for operations so they could answer the calls with words that would not inflame or confuse. We took down 3 slogans from the glass and left 1 wall empty on purpose. Before I left the floor for a short walk, Zoe touched my arm. "Thank you for coming back," she said. "Not for the code, for the way you talked to us, for the patience, for the silence that teaches." I did not know what to do with those words, so I nodded and said the only true thing I had left in me. We are not done. We were not. Chaos does not surrender in a single afternoon. It retreats to the edges and waits. It finds places we forgot to guard. It invites pride to build a balcony and step out for air. But that night, as the city lit itself again in wide, gentle bands, and the river carried a double string of reflections past the piers, I felt the balance tilt toward us. On the walk back from the window, I passed the smallest conference room, the one with the bad chair and the good view. Inside, Mason and Lena spoke quietly. I could not hear the words, but I read the posture. They were planning to change more than code. It would not be fast. It would not be easy. It would be necessary. The company would either learn or fall back into the soft academic comfort of slides. As I reached our island, a notification blinked on a side monitor. A columnist had posted a correction. The phrase black box had been replaced with the phrase protective layer designed to prevent overload. I made no sound. Words are tools. Sometimes, if you sharpen them with context, they can be used to build instead of cut. Zoe looked at me as if asking permission to be hopeful. I gave it with a small smile she probably did not see. I sat again and watched the graphs and listened to the soft choir of machines doing the work they were born for. The chaos had spread in the morning. The understanding had spread in the afternoon. If we were careful, the humility would spread at night. The city outside did not thank us. Cities do not speak that way. They repay you by persisting. That is enough. Long after the last press call had ended, and the last elevator had sighed, and the last operator had poured a stiff coffee to make it through the shift, I wrote a single line in my notebook and closed it. We stopped the flood not with a wall, but with a tide that knew when to wait. And then, because I am still the same person who loves a stubborn green light on an old drive, I walked past the server room and listened. The hum had returned to its honest note. Not a song of triumph, a song of work. In that sound, I could hear the next day approaching. When dawn returned, the city did not wake so much as stretch. Windows brightened one by one, shy at first, then certain. Elevators coughed, traffic lights rehearsed their colors, and the river remembered how to shine. You could feel a tremor of relief under the pavement, the kind that comes when a nightmare ends but its echo still walks behind you. I had not gone home. None of us really had. The night blurred into morning like code without line breaks. Zoe brought me a cup of something that called itself coffee but tasted like persistence. We sat by the wide glass wall and watched sunlight spill through the fog of our exhaustion. "We stabilized 83% of the grid," she said. Her voice was thin but steady. "Lix is breathing again." "Breathing is good," I said. "Now we have to teach it not to hold its breath every time someone touches it." Across the room, Mason spoke softly into a headset, the way a parent whispers to a child who is almost asleep. Lena typed notes for a briefing that would spin our sleepless miracle into numbers the board could read. Elliot was there too, standing apart, a man rehearsing an apology he could not yet pronounce. I turned back to the screens. The graphs were calm, too calm. No system this size is ever perfect. Perfection is an omen. I zoomed in until the noise reappeared, little flickers of asymmetry, jitter where the rhythm had once been a flat line. That was better. Life had returned. Zoe, I said, open the audit logs. Let's see who's been touching the dispatcher overnight. She blinked, surprised. You think someone? I think habit is stronger than any directive. The log unrolled down the screen like an uncoiling memory. Routine access calls, status checks, test packets, then a cluster of entries from 2 hours earlier. The signature was familiar. Elliot, I looked across the room. He was staring at his tablet, jaw clenched. Bring him here, I said. Zoe hesitated only a second before walking over. They spoke quietly. He followed her back, his eyes flicking toward the others as though asking for an audience that would share his version of the truth. What were you doing in the dispatcher at 4:15? I asked. He lifted his chin, verifying stability. That is what the monitors are for. I wanted to understand how your patch works. Curiosity is healthy, I said, but you didn't open the read-only mirror. You entered the live environment. He did not answer. The silence stretched, thick with tired breathing and the faint buzz of servers. Finally, he said, I saw something strange in the logs. A dormant process labeled Failsafe Biad Protocol. It's active again. I thought it might be malicious code. It's not documented anywhere. Zoe's eyes widened. Mason turned toward us, tension sharpening his voice. What is that? I exhaled slowly. It's not malicious, it's the guardrail, the system you tried to remove last year, the part that prevented the blackout from becoming collapse. Elliot frowned. It shut down half the grid. It shut down half to save the rest, I said. That's not failure, Elliot. That's compassion written in logic. He looked at me as if the word compassion had no right to live near code. You built software that makes moral decisions. I built software that mimics the one we should have made. The room fell still. Outside, sunlight struck the glass and drew bright scars across the floor. Lena stepped closer, voice calm but careful. Is the protocol still active? Yes, I said. It will stay active until Helix confirms balance for 24 consecutive hours. Then it will sleep again. And if someone tries to disable it? She asked. I met her eyes. It won't allow it. Elliot's shoulders stiffened. You're saying you gave it autonomy. I gave it boundaries. The difference between a city and chaos is knowing when to stop. He rubbed his temple. You realize what that means for compliance, for liability? Lena cut him off. It means we survived. We'll handle the paperwork later. Mason leaned on the edge of the console. Gloria, the board will want a report. They'll want to know exactly how this protocol functions. They can have one, I said, but they won't understand it if we write it like a confession. We'll write it like a lesson. By afternoon, the building had the smell of too many sandwiches and not enough air. Reporters gathered outside. Someone set up a tent for interviews that would not happen. Inside, we drafted the official statement. The first sentence took an hour because truth must be measured before spoken. We finally wrote, Helix entered protective mode to prevent further instability during unauthorized configuration changes. Protective mode, not failure, not crash, 2 words that carried the weight of everything we had endured. Elliot paced while we polished each paragraph. They'll still call it sabotage, he muttered. Something that self-activates without permission? It didn't need permission, I said. It needed purpose. He stared at me, bewildered, as if I were speaking a dialect from a planet he'd never visited. Then, quieter, I didn't mean to break it. I know, I said. Most ruin comes from good intentions served too fast. That was the closest we ever came to forgiveness. Evening approached. The skyline shimmered gold, its reflections chasing one another along the river. Lena asked me to join her in Mason's office for a video call with the regulators. The air inside was cooler, the light cleaner, the tone of the people on the other end more careful than before. They asked their questions, and I answered them the way I write code. Line by line, no decoration, no excuses. When I finished, one of them, the same voice that had called me anonymously the day before, said, MS Biad, thank you for designing a system that refused to obey recklessness. After the call, Mason closed his laptop and rubbed his eyes. They'll rewrite the oversight protocols, he said. They'll name committees after this. You just started a small revolution. I only wrote instructions, I said. They wrote the outcome. He smiled tiredly. Either way, the lights are on. When I returned to the main floor, most of the team had gone. Only Zoe remained, cross-legged on a chair, staring at the new dashboards. The graphs pulsed with quiet regularity. She looked up and grinned. Stable for 10 hours, she said. I think Helix is starting to forgive us. Systems don't forgive, I said, setting down my notebook. They adapt. Forgiveness is what we do afterward. She tilted her head. So what now? Now, I said, we teach. We spent the rest of the night rewriting the documentation from the ground up, not the sterile manuals written for auditors, but a living map, every decision, every safeguard, every story behind a line of code. I made her promise to keep a copy offline, far from the temptation of marketing edits. She wrote a note on the cover in blue marker, The Lighthouse Guide. I laughed when I saw it. Good name. It's yours, she said. You drew it. No, I said. It was already there, I just traced it. Near midnight, I took one last walk through the building. The hallways were quiet except for the heartbeat hum of the servers. I paused at the door of the control room and watched the slow dance of status lights. Green, green, one amber blink that winked and disappeared. Perfect imperfection. In the reflection of the glass, I saw my own face softened by fatigue. A year ago, I would have called this defeat. Tonight it looked like peace. Behind me, footsteps, Elliot again. He stopped beside me, eyes on the same lights. For once, he didn't try to speak first. I read your old documentation, he said finally. You wrote that complexity is a kind of honesty. I did. I didn't understand it until now. Understanding is earned, I said. It costs time. Most people prefer the discount version. He smiled faintly. You're not going to let me forget this, are you? I don't have to, I said. You already won't. He nodded, then extended a hand. It was not an apology, not yet. It was the beginning of one. I took it. Outside, the city breathed in long, steady intervals. From the tower's height, it looked almost tender, a living organism knit together again after surgery. The skyline blinked like a nervous heartbeat finding confidence. I opened my notebook and wrote one final line before closing it. Systems do not break to punish us. They break to remind us that balance must be lived, not coded. The night held its breath. Somewhere below, a transformer hummed, a street lamp flickered, and Helix whispered back in its quiet electric language, the same one I had always heard beneath the noise. The system was alive. The city was alive. And for the first time in months, so was I. The day began quietly enough. The city breathed in slow rhythm, as though testing its own pulse. From my apartment window, I could see the power lines tracing their steady heartbeat again, lights flickering along the skyline like notes in a song that finally remembered its melody. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt the weight of a truth that had been growing louder in my mind since the night of the blackout. Helix had not failed. It had obeyed. Every data pattern, every voltage dip, every controlled shutdown, it had followed instructions that no one else remembered writing. I had built those instructions. They were never meant to hurt anyone. They were meant to protect the system from what humans do best, pushing past the limit because they can. When I reached the office, the building felt lighter, but only at first glance. The workers smiled at one another, pretending to celebrate recovery. Underneath the surface, tension hummed like a low current. They feared what they didn't understand, and now they were surrounded by it. Zoe met me at the entrance with 2 coffees in her hands. She looked tired but radiant, like someone who had seen both destruction and rebirth. You should read this, she said, handing me a folded printout. It was the morning's internal report, the one Lena would present to the board. The headline read, Helix Restoration Ongoing, Preliminary Analysis Attributes Blackout to Legacy Protocol Malfunction. Malfunction, that word was a knife wrapped in diplomacy. I read the summary twice, then looked at Zoe. They still think it broke itself? They don't want to believe otherwise, she said. If they admit Helix shut down to protect itself, it means someone here made it do that. Someone did, I said. Me. Her eyes widened. You mean? Yes, I said softly. Helix didn't collapse. It executed a safeguard. It saw what was coming and pulled the plug before the system burned. Everything we lost that night, we would have lost 10 times over if it hadn't. Zoe set the coffee down. You need to tell them. They're not ready to hear it, I said. They're still looking for a villain, not a prophet. I walked to the window and watched the city again. The streets were alive, the trains were moving, and yet all I could think about was the line of code that had changed everything. I remembered typing it years ago, a half-conscious act of foresight. If unauthorized modification detected, initiate containment. Now that single phrase had rewritten the fate of millions of lives. Lena found me an hour later in the engineering lab. Her tone was polite, but the strain in her voice betrayed the weight she carried. The board wants a full reconstruction of what happened that night, she said. They're forming a review committee. They'll want a culprit, I said. They'll want clarity. Clarity is dangerous, I said. It forces you to look at what you refuse to see. Then maybe it's time we look, she said. Mason agrees. Mason appeared behind her, holding a tablet filled with error charts. We can't keep calling this a legacy fault, he said. Not after what we found this morning. The logs show a series of preemptive shutdowns that match no known algorithm except the BIAD protocol. I met his eyes. Then you know the truth, he nodded slowly. It was never an accident. The room fell quiet. For a moment, the hum of the air conditioning was the only sound. You built a system that saved us, Lena said finally, and they fired you for it. Saved you from yourselves, I said. Helix only did what it was taught. Elliot walked in then. His voice broke the fragile stillness. You mean what you taught it. You made it decide when to pull the plug on us. You gave it the right to choose. I gave it the right to stop obeying stupidity, I said. You call that rebellion, I call it survival. He shook his head, anger flickering beneath exhaustion. You played God, Gloria. No, I said. God builds and watches. I built and warned. You ignored the warning. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mason turned toward Elliot. You deleted the failsafe without authorization. You called it obsolete. That's the root cause. This entire disaster began the moment you erased caution from the code. Elliot's voice lowered. She hid that protocol from us. That's why we didn't know. You can't blame me for removing something invisible. It wasn't invisible, I said. You just didn't understand it. Zoe stepped forward, her voice trembling with both fury and faith. She left notes everywhere. Warnings, comments, whole paragraphs explaining why the layer mattered. You never read them because they weren't written in the language of efficiency. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. It was the sound of realization settling into pride's hollow shell. Lena exhaled and rubbed her temples. Enough, we'll deal with accountability later. Right now, we focus on full restoration. I turned back to the terminal and opened the system core. Line after line of code filled the screen, my handwriting in syntax, old but unbroken. I traced the paths with my eyes, following the logic like arteries through a body. I could feel Helix breathing again. This isn't about restoration, I said. It's about comprehension. You can patch a machine, but if you don't understand what it tried to teach you, it'll fail again. What did it try to teach us? Lena asked quietly. That balance isn't efficiency, it's empathy. She studied me, searching for irony. There was none. I typed a sequence to reopen the buried log, the one no one had dared touch. The screen flashed and a message appeared. Failsafe BIAD protocol, mission log executed by system consensus. Reason, prevention of irreversible overload. Status, success. Secondary objective, protect human operators. Beneath that, a time stamp. The exact moment the blackout began. Elliot stared at the screen as if it were a mirror reflecting something he couldn't face. It wasn't even your hand, he said slowly. The system decided on its own. It didn't decide, I said. It remembered, he frowned. Remembered what? The rules we gave it, the rules you forgot. I turned to Mason and Lena. You can write your report however you like, but include this line. Helix did not malfunction. It fulfilled its purpose. Mason nodded. And you? I'm going to rewrite the foundation, I said. Not the code, our relationship with it. You've all spent years treating Helix like a tool. It's not. It's a reflection. Every shortcut you take, every arrogance you justify, it amplifies. That's what caused the collapse, not the machine, the mirror. Lena's voice softened. Then maybe it's time we learned how to look at ourselves. By late afternoon, the board meeting began. They gathered in the glass chamber on the top floor like judges at an invisible trial. Cameras were forbidden, but everyone knew this would define the company's history. Mason presented first, his voice firm, his data precise. He explained the sequence of events leading to the blackout, the unauthorized removals, the failsafe's activation, the layered recovery. Then he paused and gestured toward me. The architect of Helix's original failsafe is here, he said. She has something to add. I stood, not to defend myself, but to defend the truth. I was not wrongfully terminated, I began. I was correctly ignored. You saw my caution as obstruction. You saw my warnings as weakness. But what you failed to see was that systems don't fail because of complexity. They fail because of simplification. I let the silence fill the room. When Helix shut down, it wasn't rebelling. It was protecting you. It understood that the danger wasn't external, it was internal. It's not a rogue machine. It's a loyal one that remembered its oath after you forgot yours. I looked at their faces, at the unease behind polished expressions. If you want Helix to serve you again, don't make it obedient. Make it trusted. No one spoke for a long while. Then Lena said softly, "You've given us back more than a system." I nodded. "I've given you a second chance to deserve it." That night, I stayed in the lab long after everyone had gone. The city was quiet again, the hum of stability returning like an old friend. I opened the command window one last time and wrote a note in the new system log. The biad layer is no longer a failsafe. It is a reminder. Trust must be coded by hand every single day. I saved the file and closed the terminal. Outside, the wind brushed against the glass, carrying the soft murmur of a city alive. Somewhere, a child switched on a lamp. Somewhere else, a nurse turned on a machine. Millions of tiny signals, all trusting one another without ever meeting. That was Helix's true legacy, not perfection, but connection. I whispered to the dark, "You did well, my friend." And deep within the servers, a green light blinked once in quiet acknowledgement. The morning after the board meeting, the world outside seemed to have finally exhaled. The news anchors spoke of recovery instead of collapse, of resilience instead of blame. They still mentioned my name sometimes, but now it carried a different weight. It was no longer followed by words like alleged or questioned. It was followed by architect, innovator, and once, by something that made me laugh, guardian of the grid. I hadn't slept. I walked to the window and watched the sunlight roll across the city. The reflection of the towers on the river looked like two worlds trying to meet. I thought of how Helix had once seemed invisible, like a god that no one prayed to until it went silent. Now, people finally saw it for what it was, a fragile promise that only lived because someone cared enough to make it breathe. When I arrived at the office, the lobby was quieter than usual. The smell of new paint and lemon polish lingered in the air. They had cleaned everything overnight, as if scrubbing away the fear. On one wall, they'd put up a new slogan, "Resilience is our power." I smiled to myself. Marketing always learns the truth after the engineers do. Lena greeted me near the elevators. She looked rested for the first time in weeks. "We've been rewriting the recovery protocols," she said. "The regulators approved our draft this morning. They want you to review it before it becomes official." "I will," I said, "but not today. Today I just want to see the system running." The 10th floor looked different now. The bright red warning screens were gone, replaced by calm blue graphs pulsing like steady heartbeats. Engineers moved quietly, not with fear, but with focus. They had learned to listen to silence. Zoe waved from her desk, her smile wide and genuine. "You're trending again," she said. "Someone wrote an article calling you the conscience of Helix." "I'd rather they called me unemployed," I said. "Conscience doesn't pay rent," she laughed. "They also called you dangerous." "Then maybe they finally understand me." We stood side by side, watching the data scroll. The world's heartbeat was back, line after line of light weaving through the screen. I leaned forward, scanning the sequences, half expecting something to be wrong, but everything was right. Stable, rhythmic, alive. For the first time since the blackout, I felt peace. Elliot appeared in the reflection of the glass behind us. His suit was still perfect, but the arrogance had gone out of it. He looked smaller, younger, human. "They're giving me a different position," he said quietly. "Not demotion, just distance, systems oversight." "That's fitting," I said. "You'll be watching what you used to underestimate." He nodded. "I wanted to say thank you for not letting me destroy it completely." I turned toward him. "You didn't destroy it, Elliot. You reminded it why it needed protection." He smiled, then left without another word. I watched him go and felt something close to forgiveness, not the kind that absolves, but the kind that understands. Mason joined us later, holding a folder full of new plans. "The board approved the funding for the Helix Education Initiative," he said. "We're going to build training centers across the grid. You'll have your own program, Biad Systems Ethics, they're calling it." "That name sounds like a warning label," I said. "Maybe it should be," he said, smiling. "The world could use a few." Lena appeared beside him, handing me a tablet. "You'll like this. The regulators are releasing an official statement this afternoon. They're calling Helix's response the most sophisticated example of autonomous protection ever recorded. They've changed their language." "From malfunction to miracle?" I asked. "Exactly that," she said. I took a breath and looked at the two of them. "You know what this means, right? They'll start building again. They'll take what we learned and replicate it. More systems, more cities, and someone will try to simplify it again. They always do." "Then we'll be ready," Mason said. "Maybe," I said softly, "but readiness doesn't prevent arrogance. Only memory does." That was the lesson. Not just to design smarter, but to remember longer. I walked to the whiteboard that still carried the coastline I'd drawn during the crisis. The tide, the rocks, the lighthouse. Someone had written beneath it in neat letters, "We pull the net, we wait for calm." I traced the line of the shore with my finger and smiled. Zoe came up beside me. "You're leaving soon, aren't you?" "I think so," I said. "The system doesn't need me hovering anymore. It's grown past me. That's what creation is supposed to do." "Where will you go?" "Somewhere quieter," I said. "Maybe by the sea. Machines aren't the only things that need balance." She looked down, pretending to rearrange papers. "Will you come back if something happens?" I turned to her and said. If something happens, you'll know what to do. You've already learned to listen when the silence starts to hum. Her eyes glistened. You always talk like the system is alive. It is, I said, because we are. By evening, I was gone. No farewell meeting, no speeches. Just one final walk through the corridors where the hum of Helix echoed like a familiar song. I paused once at the glass wall overlooking the river. The water glowed faintly with reflected lights, steady and forgiving. The city had healed. I placed my hand against the glass and whispered, "Thank you." Somewhere deep below, a pulse of green moved across the network. A signal, a nod, a heartbeat answering back. When I stepped outside, the wind smelled of rain. Clouds were gathering over the horizon, soft and luminous. The world was preparing for another test, another challenge, but I was not afraid. The system would hold. As I walked away from the tower, I thought of the first night of darkness, of the moment when every light had gone out and the world had mistaken protection for failure. How often we do that, curse the very thing saving us from ourselves. Helix had taught me that silence is not absence. It's wisdom. It's the pause between one mistake and the chance not to repeat it. At the corner, a cafe still flickered with neon light. People inside were laughing, the power steady, the music low. Life had gone on. That was the true victory. I ordered tea, sat by the window, and opened my notebook. There were only a few blank pages left. I wrote the final line in slow, deliberate strokes. Machines learn from data. People learn from consequence. The miracle is when both remember. I closed the notebook and let the city breathe around me. The hum returned, soft, constant, alive. The algorithm of silence had spoken one last time. And this time, we finally listened.